everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. I am recording this on New Year's Day, this intro at least. And beautiful day here today. And I hope this is the first episode of Psychedelics Today you get to listen to in 2021. So thank you for being here through all of 2020. It's been quite the ride. So today on the show, we have Gary Michael Smith, Esquire. He wrote the recent Psychedelica Lex book. Gary's an attorney in Phoenix, Arizona. He's done some really interesting cannabis and psychedelic law, work with the Peyote Way Church of God. And yeah, we go all over the place in this episode. Gary's also got some really interesting projects underway that I don't necessarily want to share yet. But needless to say, there's going to be some exciting stuff happening in the U.S., legally speaking, I would say in the next year or so. So yeah, really stay tuned for that. So really enjoyed this interview with Gary. Gary has his own podcast too. So check that out. Just Google his name, you'll find it. And we'll have links to that in the show notes as well. Yeah, Gary really digs into the different angles around legal access to psychedelics. So his work with the Peyote Church was religious, and interestingly, I think it's only at the state level, which is really curious that they didn't have to really worry about the federal law or like actively petitioning the federal government. So cool stuff. And yeah, I just really appreciate Gary's efforts here, both with his podcast and his blog and his book. Psychedelica Lex will save psychedelic attorneys quite a lot of time. Gary's done all the research, so you don't have to, at least up to a certain point in time, because when you submit it to the publisher, it's kind of a little tricky to update. And there have been a couple interesting things, but past legal precedent is quite extensively covered in there. And it's a beautiful book too. So I just flipped it open. I got absorbed in some of the storytelling there. And yeah, just the legal stories are actually at times very compelling and very interesting. So yeah, check it out. If you're interested in the legal angle, go for it. Pick this book up, Psychedelica Lex, and check out Gary's work. This will not be the last time you hear from Gary on this show. I go down to Arizona quite regularly and hope to record a bunch with Gary in the future. So I think that's it for now. If you're listening to this on Monday, January 4, wait, is that right? How does this podcast work? Oh yeah, we put episodes out on Tuesdays. So on Tuesday, January 5, when this episode comes out, you'll have maybe a day or so before we start up our Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists course, the 8-week live supported course you've probably heard us talk about at length on here. And it might actually be sold out, but if you want to get in, check out psychedeliceducationcenter.com and check it out. There is a wait list function there in case somebody drops out. You can jump in. Everything's recorded, so you don't really lose too much. And if you can't make that class, we'll have some new dates listed really, really soon. It should start up in March for the next 2 groups that we run. And there might actually even be a special, more lightweight offering for students interested in similar material. So stay tuned for that as well. I think that's it for now. Yeah. Oh, worth noting. I think we are launching a program and series for clergy. So people who are ordained and active. There might be room for retired folks or people who are still in seminary or whatever the lingo is these days. So email us if you want to learn more about that. Psychedelics Today email at gmail.com, and we'll shoot you a link. We're not going to take everybody. This is going to be a small group at first, and we're going to do our best to maintain everybody's privacy. And, because you start talking about drugs as a priest, you might get in big trouble. So hard saying for sure. But yeah, so reach out if you want to learn more about that, and we'll send you some links so you can apply to be part of the group. Meetings will probably start up in early February 2021. All right, I think that's it for now. Sorry for the long intro. And yeah, we'll see you on the other side. I hope you enjoy this episode with Gary Michael Smith, Esquire. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. Today on the show, we have the author of Psychedelica Lex, Gary Michael Smith, Esquire, an attorney working in Arizona. Hey, Gary, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Lovely, lovely. I'm excited to catch up with you because this is a really interesting topic and angle you're approaching the psychedelic world from. I am kind of regularly telling people they need to go find an attorney to talk to about this stuff because they're asking me, can I open up like a retreat now in Denver and host mushroom sessions? It's like, no. God. Like, well, yeah, I'm sure you can, but how much do you like prison?
Yeah, it was yes to everything until you said the word mushroom. So you can retreat, you can have sessions, just not with mushrooms.
Totally. Yeah. So it's a really great role you're playing by, putting together this huge book. This looks like it took you a while. And
it did.
Yeah. Well, so before I guess we get into the book, let's talk a little bit about you.
Sure.
So you're initially from New York, is that right?
Yeah. Let me give you the small little personal bio. So I am born and raised in New York, just outside of New York City, in an urban suburb in Westchester County. Spent my formative years, of course, there. Went on to college at a SUNY in upstate New York and obtained an undergraduate degree in English literature. And from there, went straight on to law school and had enough of the East Coast by that point. So I actually went to San Diego because you don't have to shovel the sunshine in San Diego. Mm-hmm. So I went to law school and actually went through law school in 2 years instead of the traditional 3 years. My law school had a semester system that was a trimester system instead of the traditional 2. So I just banged out law school straight through instead of taking summers off. And then from there, just jumped out into private practice. And I've been a practicing attorney now for the better part of 28, 29 years.
Outstanding. And what got you interested in this psychedelic topic?
I can't point to any one thing, but sure. Here's the short version of that story. So a decade ago, Arizona took a second stab at some sort of a medical marijuana program. It's indeed the program we have now. And when Arizona started to look at this, and this was back in 2010, there were very few, and I mean count on one hand few, lawyers who were interested in it, willing to jump into it, and who trusted it. I looked at it. I've always been the guy who's been attracted by the weird and unusual and said, that's for me. So I jumped in aggressively with both feet. And this is on the heels of having a very substantial construction litigation practice of all things. I cut my teeth in the law doing principally litigation. And in that arena, a lot of it was construction law and then just general commercial litigation on top of that. And strangely, a lot of those concepts translated over very cleanly to a cannabis practice. So as a result of this brand new body of law that hadn't even passed yet, I just started to self-educate. And the more I read, the more I got interested. And the more I got interested, the more I read. And it just continued to snowball. And, naturally, when you're reading about cannabis, you do inevitably bang into other plant medicines as you're reading. And, of course, that happened to me. And I got more interested and just kept diving in deeper and deeper. And all of a sudden, I saw that like all of world history, all of world culture had a connection to plant medicines. And that was it. I got sucked in and I've been loving it ever since.
That's amazing. Yeah. And the thing that caught my eye about you at first was that you had worked on a peyote church in Arizona. Is that right?
That is correct. I am general counsel to the Peyote Way Church of God.
And I think I met those folks at the Arizona Psychedelic Conference in Tempe.
Yeah. That was 2-3 years ago, right?
Maybe early last year. Feels like 5 years. I think it was February 2019, but it feels like 8 years back.
It could. The pandemic has so scrambled my sense of chronology. Because I have been hiding out in my home office for almost the past year. So yeah, you could be right. It might have been last year.
Yeah. And I my table was actually right next to them.
Ah.
So it was really kind of neat. So what was their approach? So like to kind of get into the legal angle here, like they had a peyote church that they wanted formed and to get standard legal protections. And you started working with them?
Okay, so part of what I'll share with you is what I know because of what I have learned in talking with them. But in fairness to the question and to your viewers, or really your listeners, nobody's viewing us. In fairness to the listeners, I came to the church much later in its existence. So a lot of their trials and tribulations, so to speak, predate me. And in a great extent, arguably predate me even being a lawyer. And again, I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years. So their story basically goes like this. Ann and Matthew, the two folks you met who run the church today, spent the better part of their youth touring the globe looking for these spiritual entheogenic experiences. And they had been to South America, Central America, Asia, Europe, you name it, and spent years just learning and traveling and educating themselves. At some point, they returned back to the United States and met the actual church founder, Mana. And Mana is now deceased. He died some years ago. But Mana came up in the Native American church tradition. But in the 60s, he had wanted to make the church more open to non-Native Americans, which at the time was, in his circles, kind of a taboo topic. So Mana made a decision to branch out and form his own iteration of the Native American church that embraces a lot of the same spirituality concepts, but just opens it up to all races, all denominations. So that was the founding of the Peyote Way Church of God. It actually predates Ann and Matthew in point of fact. Now, when Ann and Matthew finally met up with Mana, they had set up shop in Texas. But Texas didn't have any sort of peyote protection statute, so they did get in some legal hot water there. Which ultimately resulted in them relocating to Arizona because Arizona does have a peyote protection statute.
And who was that? Anna, Matthew?
Ann and Matthew.
Ann and Matthew. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Well, that's great. And
Matthew Kent and Ann Zapp, if you need last names.
Yeah, awesome.
And by the way, the Peyote Way Church of God does have a website, and to their credit, several months ago, they finally updated the website. So it's pretty user-friendly now and has a lot more visual appeal than it used to. They had a website for years and years and years, but it looked like, the kid next door programmed it. So
sure, yeah.
Thankfully, it's a little more modern and more user-friendly. So there's history about the church on there, contact information, little bios and stuff, and you can read all about it.
And do they have any kind of angle around conservation? It seems like they are trying to do some sort of sustainable program.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So they produce all their own peyote for church purposes. They have DEA accreditation for that. They are very vocal about people not harvesting in the wild and not damaging this threatened species. They absolutely have full awareness and cognizance that it's very difficult to grow this plant and that climate change and the encroachment of man are continuing to put increasing pressure on this very rare and special plant. So they absolutely discourage peyote use outside of religious context. And within religious context, they encourage, self-cultivation for the group so that you're not damaging what's out in the wild.
That's excellent. Right. And to make it explicit, like, the major reason I have for, not being super pro peyote consumption for most Americans is that it could take away from Native American churches' access because, the stores are going down. And I'm really just happy to see that they're taking that very seriously.
Oh, my, yes. And they're not shy about telling you about it either. And the reality is that, the peyote cactus is one amongst many species that produces mescaline. So you have natural alternatives that produce identical effects, albeit in different concentration. So you don't need peyote per se to get the effects that peyote gives you. You can get it from other cacti.
Yeah, absolutely. And San Pedro grows a lot faster, but as we were discussing earlier, consuming 2 feet of San Pedro is a little complicated.
Yeah, and in fairness to your listeners who might not have been around to hear our earlier conversation, what Joe and I were musing about was the fact that peyote is popular because it has a natural high concentration of mescaline. But these other species of cacti also produce mescaline, and one of them is San Pedro, which is a very common cactus that you can actually get in most nurseries.
Yeah,
and it grows very quickly. But the catch is you would need, on average, depending on a number of conditions, including the quality of your San Pedro and circumstance in which it's growing, you'll need about 2 foot of it to approximate the effect of like what a one good, solid, big peyote would produce. So it's a significant volume you're trading, but for a good cause, because you're helping to protect a species.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you get, so they got protection in Arizona. Did they end up getting federal protection?
Well, effectively, yes, through a number of reasons. First off, they had branched off from the Native American church, so they kind of already had a favorable headwind because there are federal statutes that specifically protect Native American religions and religious practices.
Mm-hmm.
But then they have 2 additional benefits that help them. One is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was enacted during the Clinton administration, which weirdly enough comes about indirectly because of a peyote case, the Smith versus Oregon case. And then the other thing that protects the church is Arizona's peyote protection statute, which is not unique to Arizona. There are other states that have it. Colorado and New Mexico, for example, have such statutes. So the way that this essentially works is the federal law, and again, this is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, says that the federal government has to employ a certain standard in reviewing whether or not a federal statute or law is permitted to intrude upon a religious practice. I can go into deep dive. I don't know if this is going to overwhelm your viewers. Well,
let's try. Let's try briefly. Let's do it in 5.
Okay.
If we can.
All right. Fair enough. So here's a quick history lesson, and understand sure. I'm omitting a lot of details. So viewers at home understand there's way more complexity than what I'm about to say. So the standard used to be this compelling interest test. And that came about through a case called Sherbert. And for decades, that was the standard. So whenever some sort of a religious question case came before the courts, and we're talking from trial court all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, the compelling interest test would basically ask, hey, government, does the law you're trying to enforce here, or the enforcement of the law, do you have a compelling interest that is so compelling, in fact, that it justifies saying to this religion or to this person who is engaged in religious observance that their practice must yield in favor of the law? And that was the standard for years and years and years, and it worked well. But then near about, I think, 1990 or 93, I can't remember which, the Smith versus Oregon case came down. And the case involved a couple of Native Americans who wanted to apply for an unemployment claim because they had a religious observance that conflicted with certain workdays, so they couldn't work. And they wanted, on religious bases, to be able to take advantage of unemployment because, through their analysis, they weren't able to work because of the religious basis, not because of something else. And the court ultimately came down and said, no, there's no compelling interest here whatsoever. And in point of fact, the court went a huge step further and did away with the compelling interest test altogether. Now, the flashpoint in that case, which is monumentally huge, and unless you're a lawyer or a law nerd, you're not going to really appreciate this. But the flashpoint was that this particular opinion was authored by Justice Scalia, who had a lifetime of being acknowledged as an exceedingly pro-religion justice on the court. And here he was, not only wiping away the Sherbert test with his opinion, but also establishing the primacy of federal law essentially above religion. Which, if you know things about Scalia, that's really weird. The backlash came very quickly. Okay, now this is coming back to me. It was 1990 was the case. So by 1993, mere 3 years later, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was enacted by a significant, overwhelming vote in Congress. And what the Religious Freedom Restoration Act did was effectively restored the compelling interest test, nullified, in effect, the ruling of Smith versus Oregon, and restored the Sherbert test. So in doing that, it put the onus back on the government to prove the negative rather than putting it on the litigant to prove the positive, which was a huge boon to religious enforcement. And you see this translated in the modern day in cases like Hobby Lobby, which came down just a few years ago. Now, you might be aggrieved by the Hobby Lobby's decision, but the underpinning of it was that religion won out over regulation. So I kind of view the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA as we call it, as being somewhat pro-entheogen.
Well, that's outstanding.
Yeah, sorry if that was a little overwhelmingly lawyerly. I can dial it down further if need be.
So this kind of brings us to your book, Psychedelica Lex. I was flipping through the book this morning and found this thing on the First Amendment. Like essentially, the First Amendment, it seemed to be more related to religion than almost anything else. Which is the first time I had reread it in a while.
Well, the First Amendment protects speech and religion both. So the fact that they happen to travel in the same amendment, don't let that throw you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just really appreciated your breakdown there, and that's essentially what I was picking up from your book this morning. Somehow, thankfully, I flipped to that section first.
Good. And you were able to read it and understand it?
Yeah, enough. Enough.
Okay.
I think this is accessible to non-attorneys.
And that was critically important to me. I tried like the devil to make this book accessible to non-lawyers. It's absolutely meant to be a practice manual that lawyers could and should use and have on their shelves to pull off and use as needed. But I tried to write it at a level that you didn't need a law degree to make use of the book.
Right. Yeah, and that's great. But it's got to be hard, right? Because you're in this attorney-focused world where, everybody's kind of writing to each other on the inside. Like writing on the outside, it's got to be a little complicated.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like writing a tech manual for the consuming public versus, the guys who actually repair your cars. Two different levels. But to that end, I actually created this dumb little icon of an exclaiming brain. It's a human head with an exclamation point next to it. And I pepper that throughout the book where I reach sections where even I think like, wow, that's going to be tough for anybody to read. So at least it gives you, if you'll pardon the pun, a heads up that the section you're about to read might require an aspirin before you start reading.
I like how I just flipped it open to one of my favorite things to talk about is the Federal Analog Act of '86. And you've got the icon there.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. And that's an appropriate place for it because that's a very dense bit of law that has some arcane stuff in it.
Did you ever encounter like Sasha Shulgin's kind of testimony around the Analog Act and at times when folks were being prosecuted under that?
No, not specifically, but tell me more. I'm curious now.
So I forget where I heard about it. It might have been in the documentary film someone made about him called Dirty Pictures. And he would be like an expert witness. And I think he had some sort of relationship with the DEA and who knows how that was really playing out, but they really wanted to get him to agree that a molecule was substantially similar to another molecule. And he said that's like such an arbitrary judgment, substantially similar. Like, what does that actually even mean? So he was able to go in front of courts and say that kind of thing. That's at the heart of all
these analog cases. Yeah, I'm not at all surprised to hear that Shulgin would have resisted the urge to have words put in his mouth.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. That is the pivot point on which all those analog cases turn. What is substantially similar? The mere fact that a carbon atom happens to be to the right of a nitrogen atom doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot, absent more information.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting project that you put together here. So I'm hopeful that people will be able to reference this and, hope I think, correct me if I'm wrong, a book like this helps to lower expenses when people want to take on a big project. Like,
Oh
okay, I
God,
want
yeah.
to start some big, thing, and you did the research already.
Yeah, well, and that's how the book came about. The short story is I went looking for this book and I couldn't find it. It didn't exist.
Mm,
So I figured, well, heck, if I'm going to have to go pull all this research, I might as well assemble it into a book and fill the void. So that's how the
mm,
book came about. It
yeah.
was written because nobody else wrote it.
That's one of my angles often. I'm just hoping people take a project so I don't have to do it.
Well,
So
then
like,
you're
I don't want
welcome.
the credit. I just want somebody to do it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm glad you're out there doing this. And have you spoken with other kind of psychedelically leaning attorneys about what you've done, or
Yeah, yeah, and that's part of it too. Is I hope the book actually creates what I affectionately call a Dumbledore's army
Mm,
of young new lawyers coming up who are going to take this on and bring it into the end zone, so to speak. I've got what, maybe 10 years of practice left. I'm in my 50s. I really don't want to keep working into my 60s and 70s. Um, so, a decade, I can accomplish a lot before I retire, but there aren't really any psychedelic lawyers yet. I'm probably the first one to publicly come out and
mm,
say that I am. And for good reason. There's really not a lot of
right.
business right now that
Hmm.
attracts this. But seeing cannabis unfold over the last decade as I have, it doesn't really take a genius to figure out that the law is way behind the curve on this, and lawmakers even more behind the curve. And there's no shame in trying to catch up or, heaven forbid, get ahead. So that's what I'm trying to achieve
Mm.
here.
So I just opened up to one of your grids, one of your charts, page 13 here, and you're running
Mm.
through like the crime statistics in Arizona.
Oh,
And I just think
yeah, yeah,
this is
yeah.
like a great thing to point out. So 2010 cannabis arrests are around 18,000 people in
Yeah,
2010, and in 2018, 14,600 or so.
yeah,
And
yeah,
like that's insane to me relative to other crimes like burglary and robbery and even murder. Like
yeah.
it's kind
Well,
of like shockingly low murder numbers, I
I
think.
know the chart you're referring to in the book, and let me
Mm,
fill in a little more about that,
sure.
because when I created those charts, it was for the purpose of just demonstrating that the same old tired refrain we keep hearing from the no camp on cannabis, where they keep saying, cannabis is a gateway drug and will lead to all these other crimes. So I said, fine, we have almost a decade of cannabis in Arizona now. Let's see if there is any validity whatsoever to that tired old refrain that cannabis leads to crime. Well, I'm pulling statistics directly from Arizona government. I'm not making them up. I'm not drawing them from any source other than the state itself. And the state reports that in the decade approximately that Arizona's had its cannabis program, crime went down in every major category.
Mm,
So, I'm not going to say cannabis led to crime reduction, but it does beg the question. But what I can say with comfort is that in the ensuing roughly decade that we've had a cannabis program in Arizona, we went from 0 patients to roughly 200,000, and crime didn't spike. It went down.
mm,
So much for the naysayers on that issue.
right. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, it's it's quite a complicated topic and such a tragedy that this whole drug war thing is still being enforced in my worldview, at least. And
Oh,
like
yeah.
a lot of attorneys helped architect it. Like it seems like Nixon had a whole crew of folks helping.
Oh, yeah. And it was only political. There was
Hmm.
no science or public policy behind it, in particular for cannabis. I have quotes in the book, and you can actually find these online. In point of fact, you can go to YouTube and just do searches for like Nixon and cannabis. He's recorded in the Oval Office expressly saying that he just wanted to get back at, I kid you not, hippies and Jews.
Right.
I wish I were making that up. I think he even commented like all the psychiatrists or psychologists were Jews and that he didn't understand their fondness for cannabis.
Yeah.
So that's how cannabis, no joke, got on Schedule 1. They didn't take testimony from any scientists. They didn't take testimony from crime reporting agencies. They just did a political action to favor Nixon, who didn't particularly like the counterculture. Which was fine. The counterculture didn't particularly like him, so it was easy.
Right. There was a really great kind of history I read. I think it was called The Most Dangerous Man in America, like it kept flipping between Nixon and Leary.
Yeah.
And Nixon just really needed an enemy.
Yeah.
And it was Leary. And it helped him with his propaganda for, I think, the war that was on at the time. And just this dangerous counterculture. Like the establishment had to feel like it was the end of the world. So they had to like do this. And Nixon's paranoia and crazy personality definitely came out.
Oh, yeah. The conservatives of that time frame, remember, they're coming out of the end of World War II, the 1950s, the single greatest expansion in the U.S. economy ever. At one point, the U.S., I think, was something like the producer of 50% of all the world's goods.
Mm.
So, we're coming out of this incredibly strong economic growth period. The people of the 1950s were strangely both socially conservative, but also economically conservative. The economy was still sort of limping along, even though people were making tons of money. Americans were afraid to spend it.
Mm.
So from that perspective, it's not really difficult to see how this counterculture of the 60s, which was so polar the opposite to the ethos of the 1950s, was so mortally threatening to them. So in the end, the lesson I take from it is this is all a study in extremes of reaction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, even with your reference to Timothy Leary, I kind of cast him in that time frame as equal parts hero and villain. I mean, the fact that you and I are even having this conversation right now is directly because of Timothy Leary. So for that, I give him credit.
Yeah.
And he did kick off this revolution in thinking. Unfortunately, I think he got a little too exuberant and ultimately did more harm than good.
Well, I think the harm came from Nixon choosing him as the enemy more so than, Leary doing his crazy thing.
Yeah, but Leary's reaction to it was above and beyond.
Oh, totally. I think he got a little wild. I think he got a little wild, totally. But I'm still a hero, but kind of an anti-hero to me. It's like, don't do this, but also like I'm in awe. It's amazing what he was. How many times did he break out of federal prison? Like 3 times. Like I can only hope that if I'm in federal, I can get out that many times.
Yeah, I think your phrase anti-hero is absolutely spot on. And understand, I have a fondness for Timothy Leary. I don't believe in the hero worship that some people take to it.
Yeah, totally.
It's if I can, it's sort of like the same thing with Terence McKenna. Look, I love Terence McKenna. I absolutely credit him as posthumously being one of my educators. But do I deify McKenna? No. Do I agree with everything he says? No. And I see people online who start up these, Terence McKenna fan clubs, and they just want to devour everything McKenna. That's fine, but all things in their proper proportion, please.
Right. Especially when he's kind of, I like how Lorenzo Haggerty from the Salon kind of puts it as Terence is more of a bard than like a traditional philosopher or scientist.
And Lorenzo does literally refer to him as the bard, so you're right.
Yeah, and I think that's the best way to put him. Like, the stuff isn't necessarily factual or scientifically verified, though he's quite an inspiration. And we want to even his brother says a lot of what he said was just made up bullshit. So how do we couch that? It's an interesting angle. And a lot of what Lorenzo's put out, which I love, had some crazy stuff from Leary, like talking about space migration and life extension and all this stuff, intelligence squared, smile, that thing. And it's a really cool, song to march to, but it's not necessarily valid in the way that they thought it was going to be, I think. And I do love when it gets really far out and speculative, but I do understand we have to kind of couch it with the facts, unfortunately. Pesky, stubborn facts.
Have you ever read the autobiography of a yogi?
For sure, yeah.
Okay, so you remember the sections where Yogananda is talking about how he always admired these spiritual leaders, and at some point he's describing some of them, and there's one where he's talking about another yogi who was able to astrally project themselves and be in physically other places, even though their body was elsewhere. So stuff like that, like when I was reading Autobiography of a Yogi, I was thinking that's really just above and beyond any level of credibility. But at the same token, there's a kernel of truth within it if you know what to look for. So it's that same critical approach to these texts that I think people really need to focus on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is that? And how do we want to couch these unbelievable things?
Yeah. And I'll even use the example of astral projection because in its own way, I claim to have experienced it myself. But this is during meditation. I'm not physically going anywhere. I'm sitting in one space, but I'm hitting some higher consciousness point just through meditation. So I get it,
right.
But no, I'm not, physically materializing and dematerializing. Sorry, it's not Star Trek. These aren't transporters. Or like there's another reference in Yogananda's book where he refers to somebody who had their arm chopped off, but it mysteriously grew back the next day. It's like, yeah, you lost me there. Sorry, I'm not going to go with you on that trip.
Right, exactly, and that's what founds religions. Like they've got their whole kind of religion there in San Diego. What's that called? The Self-Realization Fellowship, maybe?
Oh, yeah. They're actually all over the world, and there's one here in Phoenix. They have
I didn't know that.
Very big, lovely facility right here on Central Avenue in Phoenix.
Well, I'll have to visit. Yeah, it just got a little too Catholic Church of the yoga world for me.
Yeah.
When I was jumping in. Otherwise, it was a really interesting group. And, how can you not like that book, Autobiography of a Yogi? It's a tough one.
Yeah. My approach to it, maybe I'm wrong here, was much in the same way that one would have perhaps read a Jack London novel back in the day. Because it's an exciting adventure of this guy's life. And it's autobiographical, so there's factual stuff in there for sure.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a smart move. That's a smart approach.
Yeah.
And it's in that same era as Jack London, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So why not? Yeah, and my point being, those kinds of books are what eventually form religious organizations. I want to kind of differentiate that from a spiritual organization, like a Native American church where you're actually having practices. There is some dogma, but you're having real deal experiences.
Sure.
And how do we say okay, you've got this baggage, take on this baggage. Now you're part of the group. You've got to kind of have some sort of division there. I don't really know what that totally looks like, but it's how I kind of wrestle with that personally.
Yeah.
And because we can have that. We have had that with Terrence. We've had it with Leary. Do you recall any kind of details around what Leary did in terms of forming religious organizations?
Yeah. From memory, I couldn't hope to express this accurately, but Leary did make an effort to form an LSD-based religious organization. And this was in part to try to keep his studies going because he was shut down and defunded.
Mm-hmm.
But he came across what was a smart idea, although poorly executed, which was to establish religious exemption, thereby creating a scenario in which legally your air quote parishioners could continue to participate. in these substances without fear of further prosecution or loss of liberty. The problem, though, well, there were multiple problems, but the big thing was he was trying to create this religion out of whole cloth based on LSD as a sacrament, and there had just been really no case precedential support of that. And then you look to the cases that came under Sherbert and ultimately into the modern day with RFRA. And you can see the patterns in the court really do discourage the creation of new entheogenic-based religions. Not saying it's impossible, and certainly there's nothing in the law that prohibits the creation of new religion. It's absolutely okay to create new religions. But when you're premising it on some sort of revelation because you took a psychedelic, that's a harder sell in the courts. And as Larry experienced, not winnable.
So what can we learn from that? So there needs to be a precedent of like a long history of use or just some evidence of a history of religious use?
Man, I just had a great conversation with a religious studies professor, Brad Stoddard. In point of fact, over the weekend, I posted the interview on my YouTube channel. And Brad and I talked about it to some extent. The creation of the religion itself, that's the easy part, weirdly enough. It's the convincing courts and the DEA that there's some sort of an entheogenic component to a new religion. That's the hard part. Here's why. To get the exemption from DEA so that your religious organization can use these psychedelics or entheogens, you're having to go and fill out some paperwork with the DEA. You're literally going to download forms from their website, which, by the way, the DEA does have a website, and they do have these forms, and you can download them. But in it, you're having to explain your organization's doctrine, historicity, use, etc. Now, pause for a moment and consider this. You're going to the chief drug enforcement agency in the country and saying, hey, I am asking for permission to do a thing that I'm now confessing I'm doing that is definitely illegal. And, oh, yeah, you're the law enforcement agency, and I'm filling this out to tell you about all my illegal activities and asking you permission that I can do what I'm doing. Small surprise, that doesn't sell well. And it's a flaw in the system. But it's the system we have, and it's a system in which I have to work as a licensed attorney, and unfortunately you do as well. So that's the hard part, is getting the basis of a new use established and then accepted. I think that's very hard to do. Now, compare and contrast that with, for example, like the Native American church with their peyote use, or the ayahuasca churches that have been making inroads into the United States these past few decades. They're showing up to the game, if you will, with historical use already well established, and the religious organizations themselves already well established. So they have a much easier time. And I mentioned ayahuasca a moment ago. In the last couple of decades, the ayahuasca churches have had a few run-ins with law enforcement and prevailed successfully. I mean, did really, really well in front of the courts and benefited in part because of RFRA, which is why I'm kind of encouraged by RFRA. So,
well, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So I have you seen anybody doing taking an approach that could be modeled for other groups in terms of like convincing these regulators?
Boy, you asked such a great question. You don't even know. So I've been pondering this because I'm kind of on the lookout for it, and I'll share with you the theory that I shared with Brad during our interview. And my theory is this: I think there is an argument to be made that existing religions, in particular Christianity, Judaism, and by implication Islam, because they all have this Abrahamic lineage that they share. There may be an argument, and I'm not saying for sure that it's a winner, but I think there's still an argument there, that these religions came out of entheogenic cults and into and through their early days. I think that these entheogens continued to be used and were part of religious worship and service and sacrament. And the reason I'm saying that is primarily two texts that I recommend people read. There's Allegro's book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And then there's the Brown's book, The Psychedelic Gospels. Mm-hmm. And for listeners at home who aren't familiar with either of those books or what they have to say, here's the short version. Allegro is a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, and well-respected linguist when he was alive. And he's actually the translator of the Copper Scroll, one of the original Dead Sea Scrolls that were found. And Allegro took from what he read, again, using his skills as a linguist and in his translations. And what he found was that these early Christian and Jewish sects were actually from these entheogenic cults, and in particular, the Amanita mushroom is at the heart of these cults. And then you flash forward some many years later, the Browns, who are still alive and still lecture and tour, and they published their book, and you can get this all on Amazon. The Browns decided to take that a step further, and God bless them, they went church hopping through Europe and brought their camera. And what they found are on these ancient structures that are 1,000-year-old churches, 1,500-year-old churches. There's psychedelic iconography all over the place. Mushrooms carved into the reliefs, mushrooms in the stained glass and in the paintings. How else do you explain that there? Other than this was part of some aspect of religious practice or belief. So you couple that with now what we're seeing in the archaeological records that, like, for example, last year, an archaeological journal out of Israel published a story that some scientists had taken some scrapings from a 2,300-year-old altar in the Holy Land and found cannabis residue in the scrapings. So my theory basically goes like this, that there might be enough evidence, or at least enough evidence that can be gotten if it doesn't already exist today, to make the argument that Christians, Jews, and Muslims may have a religious birthright or heritage to explore these substances, because it is part of their own religion's histories. And I would hope, I can't promise, but I would hope that a reviewing court, even as high as the U.S. Supreme Court, would say, okay, the observation and practice of any religion should, by its right, include all of its aspects, including the historical ones. And if there is a historical practice that includes entheogens in Christianity, and there is argument that there was, then Christians and Jews should be free to explore that aspect of their religion. And now I couple all that with a reference to the Native American Church, who I have tremendous respect for, and I think they've done hugely beneficial things for the Native American community. But when you look at the Native American Church practice of peyote, that's a revival. They didn't originate it. This peyote usage and peyote as a religious sacrament predates these tribes. This goes back to like the Olmecs and the Toltecs, for goodness sake. And the Native American Church ended up reviving that practice after the United States government had just heinously abused the tribes decade over decade over decade, booting them out of their ancestral lands, making them cross into the plains and onto these reservations. And it was during reservation time that these Native Americans came together and revived the peyote cult. And it's been going ever since and has done tremendously beneficial things for their community. So there's an example right out of American history of the revival of an entheogenic practice. So I think when you couple that with these historical records, Allegro's translations, et cetera, you start to see a case develop. So I've kind of officially or unofficially put out word that I'm looking for high quality studies by acknowledged archaeologists and anthropologists and that sort, to see if we can put together the case.
That's really interesting. I like that argument, but I would love to see that play out in court.
Oh, me too. but understand, and for the viewers at home who think that, I'm going to run out there and go file this lawsuit for you, you need to understand you're going through multiple layers of courts over many, many years. You're going to have to go through some kind of an actual trial with actual witnesses, and you're going to be meeting a ton of resistance. So this would require significant involvement by a number of very qualified people. And I hate to bring it down to a dollars discussion, but yeah, it's going to be bloody expensive.
Yeah.
But look, in the end, you might open the door for almost everybody to have the religious freedom to experience this. And for anybody at home who feels deeply invested in whatever iteration of religion they have, understand everything I'm talking about here shouldn't be taken as a threat or some sort of a slight of your religious belief or persuasion. Far from it. In point of fact, I think what I'm saying actually supports you. All I'm expressing here is that if there is a historicity inside of your religion or some denomination thereof, and certain of your adherents want to experience that historicity, where's the harm? I think they should be free to do so.
Right.
If anything, it would increase their bonds to the religion, not dissolve them.
Right. Yeah. Like I think regularly about how the drug war is really causing people, in and outside the country to lose faith in the country. And I think it's kind of an imperative legally for people to have these freedoms so that they don't feel like they have to break the law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Because so many people are breaking the law now that, after how many years of breaking the law do you just stop being interested in following the law? It's a really, really wild thing that I don't know that mainstream folks are really considering.
Yeah, and not to bash mainstream folks, but I think the average person doesn't really give this a deep think. It's just not something that crosses their radar screen. So I don't think it's an unwillingness to think about it just so much as it's never occurred to people to think about it. And certainly it's never crossed their paths and forced them to think about it.
Do you think in the legal profession, people are simmering on this? Like, are laws creating anarchists just by being a little too prohibitive?
Oh God.
Sorry to go kind of deep there, but it's a weird angle.
Well, sure. Any prohibition, and be clear, laws are by their nature prohibitions.
Right.
And I mean that quite literally, because think about it. In the absence of any law, if we're talking man truly in a state of nature, then the only laws you're up against are the laws of nature, not the laws of men. And everything you and I are talking about right now are the laws of men. So, when multiple people come together and say, okay, we are going to now form a civilization, they're agreeing to compromise their natural freedoms in exchange for what they perceive as some sort of a mutual benefit. So, for example, I'm just man in nature. I'm out there on my own. There are no laws governing me. Well, how long am I going to last when I'm not the apex predator and I don't have a society behind me doing things like smelting metals and giving me weapons? I give myself 3 days before something eats me. So right. I think that when people come together and form a society, there is a natural agreement that takes place between and amongst them that they are indeed going to sacrifice certain of these liberties consensually and to their betterment. Or as Thomas Paine, I guess, can take credit for writing Common Sense, same thing. You're or Rousseau with the social contract. You're agreeing to certain things because you're getting something better in exchange. So in that sense, coming back to where we started with, all laws are in some form or fashion prohibitions because they tell you things you can't do and therefore things you must do. Yeah, there will always be people who are aggrieved by that and gripe about it and want more freedom than what they perceive as presently available. Do they necessarily express the mainstream sentiment? I don't know if they necessarily express the mainstream sentiment.
Well,
and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong.
Right. I'm sure, we could kind of gripe about mainstream for a while. It's a tricky conversation because it says we might get something better and we're protected. There's actually no real clear path for opting out.
Yeah, well, and this is why I like the fact that there are religious exemptions available. So for people in a religious context, if they want to partake in some sort of entheogen, there are paths for them to do that without fear of prosecution.
Right. Absolutely. So what's happening in this legal space, other than new religions popping up that's really interesting to you?
Sure.
From the legal perspective.
Okay, so right now we've got very, very rapidly, by the way, um, investors trying to push psilocybin and MDMA through the FDA to get them on the market as prescribable medications. We all know
Mm-hmm.
MAPS is a huge supporter of MDMA, and they're now in phase 3 studies. So MDMA is almost guaranteed to come back from a temporary death, so to speak. And right behind that is psilocybin. There are a
Right.
number of groups trying to get some form of mushroom or mushroom derived medicine on the market. So, in that sense, that's good because we're seeing progress being made where these substances, which have demonstrated benefit to human beings, will at least be available to human beings again.
Right.
But equally true, there is a tremendous amount of backlash over that because people are very resentful over the fact that pharmaceutical companies are stepping in with their, big dollar bank accounts and their fancy lawyers and their fancy accountants and trying to basically scoop up and lock up and build this regulatory wall around these substances that people have been using freely for thousands of years. So, in
Mm.
the same sense that people are resentful that they have to buy water, they're resentful that they may have to buy these naturally occurring medicines, and also the fact that the medicines are being, in effect, separated from their spiritual component.
Mm.
There's resentment about that as well. But thankfully, there are politically minded citizens who are taking steps to do something about that. So, right now, because we're in election season, and my goodness, we're less than 30 days away now from the election, the state of Oregon has a psilocybin initiative on its ballot. A bunch of citizens banded together and proposed this new psilocybin law for Oregon, which the citizens of Oregon will vote on. And if they vote favorably on this new law, it will create basically this new agency in the state of Oregon that will be responsible for overseeing their psilocybin program,
Mm.
which will, they'll have a 2-year period in which to form their regulations. But what's supposed to come out of it is that there will be these psilocybin centers that will be licensed to cultivate and administer psilocybin. And there will be some level of qualification that will be created that will establish who amongst the populace is permitted to go to these psilocybin centers. And they'll be able to partake without fear of any repercussion under Oregon state law. Now, mind you, changing the state law doesn't do anything to federal law. So there's
Mm-hmm.
still very much a federal law enforcement risk over all of that. But at least at the state level, Oregon's kind of with it and trying out something new that is in a positive direction. Now, contrast that, if you will, to District of Columbia, which also has an initiative on its ballot this election season. Again, less than 30 days away. And District of Columbia took a very different approach. And what they're trying to get passed is a law that simply deprioritizes law enforcement over entheogens.
Mm.
So they're not saying, hey, we're saying this is legal now, but we are saying that law enforcement will not be able to enforce these laws at the top of their list, but they'll still be able to enforce them. So it's kind of like a don't ask, don't tell approach that DC is proposing.
Mm.
And the big difference there is this. If this DC law passes, I think the citizens of DC will be a little or a lot more free to do as they please behind closed doors in their home. But, word to the wise, it's just a deprioritization. So by God, don't go out in public and, don't flick your joint in a cop's face and say, suck it, pig, because he will beat you down with a baton and you'll deserve it and you'll wake up in a prison cell.
Mm-hmm.
So, right now we've got two very wildly divergent experiments going on in two states that are at opposite coastlines. And more to come. We've seen a bunch of cities decriminalize entheogens. But the big change has to come at the federal level if you really want security.
Right. Absolutely. And this is really important for folks to understand. Like, I see it all the time with Denver still being in Colorado, decriminalized mushrooms. It's only at the city/county level because they're the same
Right.
entity. The state and feds can easily come on in,
Oh,
and they
yeah.
have for at least one case.
Yeah. Imagine you're the poor mycology farm who's supplying the entire industry in your city. and all you've
Mm-hmm.
got is city approval. I mean, it's just such an easy target for a federal prosecutor or a federal law enforcer to step in and put a padlock on your front door as evidence.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's way too easy. And, they've got some really top investigators. So, if you think you're smarter than, these investigators, you maybe think twice. You might
Oh,
not be.
yeah. Yeah. Well, at a minimum, they have way more budget than you do.
Yeah,
So, they're going to
exactly.
outspend you on technology and they have subpoena power. You don't.
Exactly. So yeah, it's just a matter of being careful. Um,
Yeah.
so back to Oregon,
Yeah.
kind of trivia. do you, do you think we'll see the same kind of banking issue that cannabis is seeing for these organizations in Oregon?
Oh, I think worse.
Okay,
I think worse,
interesting.
frankly. And to flesh that out a little bit for the listeners at home, everything we're talking about right now, be it mushrooms or cannabis, they're all Schedule 1, which means they're forbidden. And resultingly, trade in these things and commerce in these things is also forbidden. So banks tend not to want to accept those people and that money. And they don't, particularly the federally chartered banks. They're scared to death of it because the implication for the bank, if you're knowingly the banker for a drug dealer, is you're going to be accused of participating in that drug dealing. And
Mm,
be clear, we are talking about drug dealing here. I know it's a distasteful phrase to use in the context we're talking about, but it's still drug dealing from the federal law. And the banks risk, no joke, a revocation of their banking charter. They risk being charged as co-conspirators, risk being charged as money launderers. This includes the boards of directors of these banks,
mm,
executives, officers, etc. So they have good reason to be afraid, and thus don't generally take these accounts on their books. Now, some intrepid state chartered banks kind of are a little more shall we say, risk tolerant, and thus there is a little bit of banking going on in the cannabis world. But it's very difficult to get and very difficult to maintain, and even the brave banks max out at so many depositors. So if you've got 40 different cannabis entities, not all 40 are going to be able to walk into the same favorable bank and receive treatment that they want.
mm.
So now translate that to a mushroom world. Oh yeah, I would think it'd be way worse. People are way more skittish about that.
Interesting. Yeah. So I I have close friends that were traveling around with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, like quite regularly. And
Yeah,
they would have to drive it probably unarmed to a state facility,
yeah.
once a week or every other week or something, I think it was. And, it's just how crazy is that's the
Oh, and that's literally how it is.
mm,
For folks who ever watched the series Breaking Bad, there's a terrific episode where Walter's wife Skyler had been stashing all of the money that he was making in a storage facility. And there's a scene where they go to the storage facility and there are these wooden, warehouse type pallets on the ground and stacked in neat little piles. On top of these pallets are millions and millions and millions of $100 bills just
mm,
stacked up. That is literally what it's like in some instances. No
yeah,
joke.
yeah.
And
And
it's all because the federal law won't permit the banks to take this money in, which is, I think, at the heart of really almost all the problems. Because if you could
mm,
normalize banking, everything else will fall into place.
right. Yeah. Yeah. I do think that's going to be one of the biggest wins in the cannabis world once that happens. I'm hopeful it gets sorted out in the next 2 years.
Well,
We'll see.
Biden and Harris have announced as recent as last week that if elected, they will decriminalize cannabis and permit
Mm,
banking. Hallelujah.
mm.
As if you needed a reason to vote for them.
And yeah, to like step back in time in our conversation a minute, like this idea that these large organizations are going to come in and lock down these drugs and compounds and plants
Yeah.
even further than they are now
Yes.
is, it's a really reasonable concern. Like not many of these organizations have come out publicly stating they're allies using friendly language for us.
Yeah.
the psychedelic community. And
wholly agree. One of the lead companies that catches a lot of grief in the news is Compass Pathways.
Right.
They've made the singular biggest inroads thus far with FDA. I think they're in phase 2 or phase 3 studies now, and they've got some sort of a crystalline form of psilocybin that I don't know exactly how they make it, but they're not literally giving people mushrooms. They're doing some sort of a
right. It's
psilocybin
synthesis,
extract.
GMP psilocybin created in a lab.
Yeah, and they actually need to do that because you can't patent literal nature. Like I can't go grab an oak tree, bring it over to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and say, hey, I'd like to patent this oak tree. You can't do that. But what I can do, and what people have done for hundreds of years, is to selectively breed these plants and to give them their own unique genetic signature. And I can go patent genetics. So that's where companies like Compass Pathways come in. But you also see this to a great deal in the cannabis world. And here's the irony. We're still talking Schedule 1, so you can't illicitly sell this stuff federally. But the weird thing is federal patent law, even if your thing is illegal, you can still patent it. You just can't actually apply it commercially. So if you go dive inside the Patent and Trademark Office's records, you'll find tons of stuff on cannabis. Nothing you can go buy at the store, but the patents are there. And I think this will continue. So to your point about the entheogenic crowds being displeased with what basically let's call them new pharmaceutical companies because that really is what they are. Yeah, there's reason to be upset with them. But I'm advocating a middle ground position where I think that these companies absolutely have a place. I think that they absolutely can do good. It's not the tool that's bad, it's how you use the tool. So what I'd like to see is both the fostering of this illicit market where there are companies that can mass produce and also give people in the West what they're comfortable with, which is a Western model of medicine. For whatever reason, and I'm not saying I agree with it because I don't, but I realize I'm one out of 370 million Americans. So, there's 369,999,999 million other people who have a voice. Some of them like the reliability of a guy in a white coat with a stethoscope giving them their advice. And some people like the commoditization of a pill that they can swallow with a little Dixie cup of water and go about their day. And those people should be able to have that if they want it. But for people like you and like me and the people we know, they should also be free to engage in the manner in which they have traditionally engaged. So I think as long as there is an across-the-board decriminalization so people can still do freely for themselves, let the medical model grow up next to it. There's no contradiction as far as I'm concerned, other than we choose to make the individual activity illegal. It doesn't have to be. Like, for example, we all know clandestine labs exist, and we all know that they have varying standards of hygiene. Just start with that.
Oh, yeah.
I like the idea of a DEA. Frankly, I like the idea that they're hunting down these filthy clandestine labs that are filling their products with adulterated ingredients or not even the ingredient you think you're getting. There's absolutely a place for consumer safety, and I like a world that has consumer safety in it. I like to go to the grocery store, pick my vegetables up, take them home, and not have to worry about what's on them or what's in them. I think most people would agree. So there's a place for that. But equally true, we're talking about stuff that people have used freely for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Do we really want to lock that up behind an artificial cage? I don't think so. You weren't expecting that answer, were you?
No. No. I personally am not a fan of the DEA, but I do like the idea of consumer protection. I agree with you on that point for sure. And it's on account of the drug war. Like, I want to thank Nixon, CIA establishment, and who is that first famous attorney? Chasing the Scream, Johan Hari. Do you remember this book?
No.
Anslinger. Have you heard of Anslinger? Yeah, Anslinger was the book was mostly about him.
Yeah, I know a great deal about Anslinger. Here's basically what listeners need to know. He was a racist, individual who had no rhyme or reason to do what he was doing other than his raw, naked racism. And he is single-handedly the most responsible person for why cannabis became the devil's salad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And at the end of his life, I believe he died addicted to heroin, the same drug that he was demonizing many black musicians for using.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Oh,
really
hell, man.
interesting.
Adolf Hitler was an amphetamine addict. Come on.
Right. Right. If you got to be
For real,
productive.
he was.
Well, they were injecting each other like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
I believe even our presidents were for a period of time.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too, that people don't really, I can't even say remember because it's not like they ever knew it in the first place. There were segments of U.S. history where amphetamines were just part of the landscape and normal. Into the 50s and 60s, amphetamines were handed out like candy at doctors' offices. A lot of disaffected suburban housewives who were really stressed out about being locked away in the suburbs while their husbands were off working were the prime market for those amphetamines.
Mm. Right. Right. It's super interesting. And we, that's a big deal. We don't understand our own history around these things. And that just leads us to make these crazy laws and drug war.
Yeah. Absolutely. But in fairness, I don't think that's any individual's fault because, we all grow up going to public school, getting our public education, and decision makers that came long before us and long before our teachers made a choice that we're not going to be told any of this. So, you're not really blamed for not knowing what you don't know because it's really not your fault.
Mm.
But that's why I do what I do. And, when I started to educate myself about cannabis and then these other entheogens, my eyeballs just fell out of my head because the more I read, I'm like, wow, everything I was ever told growing up wasn't just a lie. It was a conscious lie.
Oh, yeah.
And I keep finding more historical record that just undoes all the propaganda from my youth.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's really, really a crazy thing to be alive in this day and age and have to deal with all of these things they're quite unprecedented, I think, especially with them being stacked together and our joint existential crisis.
I think things will speed up now for two reasons. One, the internet has made it very difficult to hide information. For my generation, I'm Gen X. I was born in 1969. Mm-hmm. So I'm really technically the first generation to be brought up sort of full time with computers. But understand, these technologies were being invented as I was growing up. So the internet really wasn't a thing until I was really in college. That's when the internet started to become kind of mainstream. But millennials and everybody that comes after them, they have been raised full time in a digital world. They are way more accustomed to having effectively infinite access to infinite information full time. No generation's ever had that before. So that makes it much harder to hide data. Now, the conundrum they face is there's way more bullshit data. So you have to become the consummate critical thinker to sift through the lies, to find the kernels and little gemstones of truth, but they're there. They're absolutely there.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, part two of that answer is that the millennial sensibility and the Gen Z sensibility, they're way more bottom line oriented and way more skeptical. I don't think that they tend as a group to just accept blindly what they were told because it's so easy to look it up and prove that, well, you just said X and here's, 14 articles that say, no, it's not X, it's Y. You're completely wrong. Back in my day, you had to actually physically go to a library and pull a book off a shelf to figure that out. Now you've got it in the palm of your hand on your cell phone.
All the time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's really a great development. And I do think we have protection. People get a little paranoid about the future. I think that we've got a lot of smart people with an incredible amount of access to information.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Tim Leary had some riff. It might have been a Marshall McLuhan ripoff, but something about the amount of information being consumed per day, in the 1920s. Just straight up information coming into the nervous system was way, probably orders of magnitude less than it is today.
Oh, yeah.
And what does that do to culture over time? I think it helps evolve, but we'll see.
Oh yeah. Well, and
Certainly.
just never mind culture. How about just the individual human brain?
Totally. It's a
You
big
know,
deal.
the suburbs as a thing didn't really exist until the post World War II years.
Is that Levittown?
Yes,
Beautiful.
actually, yes. Well, if you like track homes. Yeah, I grew up near Long Island, so I know exactly of what you speak. And I grew up in a suburb in a track home. I think the house I grew up in was built near about 1950. So I have the life experience from that. But yeah, prior to that, you either lived in a very rural area or you lived in the what was the inner city. There were a few towns here and there, but the suburbs weren't really a thing before that. So your access to information was much less, and we're talking a time before widespread television use. Maybe you were lucky with a radio, but that was it. You had a few stations on your radio, and whatever programming was on, that was the limit. So yeah, a very finite amount of data was accessible. Today, infinite channels, 24/7.
It's incredible. All right, Gary. Well, I think we need to wrap. We're a little over an hour.
No
but
worries.
I really appreciate your work developing this book, Psychedelica Lex, The Law of Psychedelics. Anything you want to say about it?
Oh, just I would encourage everybody who's curious about this subject and wants to know more to take a look at the book. It's a little bit pricey because there's a ton of data in it and it's annotated like you wouldn't believe. But don't be shy. If you're not a lawyer, you're still going to be able to get good use out of it. There's chapters on history, chapters on law, chapters on culture. There's predictions for the future. There's a bunch of appendices. I've got some sample initiatives. I've even got a chapter on initiatives. And by the way, that is one of the audiences that I'm speaking to with this book. For those who don't know, there are 24 states in the country that allow for public initiatives. So even if your local legislators are not interested in approaching entheogens or psychedelics or any change in the law, guess what? Half the country, citizens can take that on themselves. And this book will tell you how to do it.
Amazing. So thank you again, Gary. And I hope we can do this again. And I hope we can also link up in Phoenix.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My absolute pleasure. I would be thrilled to come back anytime you want me.
And there you have it. Gary Michael Smith, Esquire. He also contributed a recent blog to our collection of great articles. Just psychedelicstoday.com/blog to read that. And I think you'll like it. I'm really excited to have gotten to know Gary and can't wait to get to know more. And could be that Phoenix is the coming hub of American psychedelia, or one of them. There's going to be so many. It's going to be lovely. So, all right. I hope you all enjoyed that episode. Let us know what you think over at Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com, or update us on one of our socials, and maybe share this with a friend. Send it to all the lawyers you know. They'll probably be interested. All right. I think that's it for now. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. We'll see you next time.